Welcome to this series exploring innovation, progress and achievement using a technocentric paradigm by Ash Stuart.
You may want to also read Ash's original Substack article for the best experience, including footnotes and other details.
Episode 43. Making Work Art. Making Art Work. Engineering Excellence. On craftsmanship that funneled knowledge, fueled innovation, and fostered genius.
What is it that makes genius? How much of it is in the persona of an individual, and how much of it comes from what I've called institutional technologies? How does it organize and amplify knowledge and skill? How does that relate to innovation? Let's start unpacking this today.
But first, let's see what our fictional friends are up to.
Irene and Brenda walk in one day going, Guys, guess what? We'll be having our stall at the town market next week for the grand annual market week. Steve and Brian look up somewhat confused. Iris the cat stops her mouse chase, and Bruno the dog pauses his tail wagging. Steve is first to respond. Wait, how did you even get a spot in there? It's indeed highly coveted, and Brian adding, We're not even professional specialists at anything of relevance. Brenda is like, there was a free opening slot and it was too tempting to resist. Irene adding the detail that they had paid out a deposit using one of their savings pots. There's a bit of a shockwave, Steve and Brian eventually going, Hold up, that deposit is like a full month of our collective income. All that's lost if we don't make it. And what exactly are we going to make to sell there? Irene, trying to look unfazed, well, the artisanal sort of stuff you know, jams, confectionaries, all the good stuff in the spirit of the season. Brenda, trying to look reassuring. Yeah, guys, we're not experts, but we can still figure it out, right? Right? In any case, the die is cast, or more accurately, the deposit is made, so better get cooking. They go on a grand groceries tour, get a bunch of stuff, and it's kickoff time. They start prepping the stuff, readying the dishes, and eventually get to the preparation proper. But things are already starting to go downhill. Irene going, No, this is not clean or tidy. Look, you're all making a mess. Think Monica from Friends. Steve is frustrated too. Come on, that's not how you chop these up. This is not the way to prep it. Where is the mise en place? He's probably watched too many French cuisine shows. With Brian chiming in, exactly, how can we prepare it properly without the ingredients laid out in order? Robin Tripp from Man About the House. Brenda then interrupts. No, guys, that's not what matters. It's the end result. We should have it right quantities. Otherwise, how can we package it properly? We should start with the end in mind. She's probably a fan of Stephen Covey. So they go on bickering like this a couple of days, and before they know, it's Friday, and they'd need to stock up the stall on Monday for the festival starting the next day. There's not much time left, and they've made no tangible progress at all. Something must be done. Even Bruno and Iris seem worried now. Although that could be for other reasons, we'll never know. So they're like, Okay, let's pause. We can't go on like this. So they sit down to discuss. They're each complaining about the incessant focus by the other three on other tasks. No, you're so uptight about the cleanliness. No, you're so worked up about the quantities. And so on. You get the picture. And then realization dawns. Right, folks. Look, we're all particular about one aspect of this. And that's because we're, relative to the others, better at that thing. So, we better set up a process and outline specific responsibilities to each of us. So Irene is into cleanliness, gets the washing mandate. Steve is methodical, gets the prepping remit. Brian looks like the cooking connoisseur, so gets to be the cook. And Brenda will handle the quantities, the packaging, and corresponding branding, etc. She should actually have been called Branda, right? The camera now shifts to the Bruno and Iris condiments stall on Tuesday morning. A fully stocked stall with 4 big smiles and all thumbs up. a furiously salivating tail wag, and a nonchalant feline. I could have done it much better, all myself eye roll.
The seeds of the rebirth.
Signore e signori, welcome to the Bottega, that premier institution that fulfilled the functions I've hinted at in this article's title and subtitle, that key marvel that underpinned the explosive growth in ingenuity, productivity, and genius in what we usually call the Renaissance. The Bottega refers to this particular type of workshop and the practices that emerged therein in 1400s Italy. The word itself simply means shop or store in Italian, cognate with boutique, but has a broader meaning for us in the current context. In line with the movable type printing press, which I covered in the previous episode, this institution can be seen as another step signaling the decisive break from the dingy past of the Middle Ages and entering the early modern era. Certainly, of entering the Renaissance, specifically the Italian Renaissance. The Italian words for this idea meaning rebirth being Rinascimento, rinascita. The form Renaissance being the French version, an alternative English form being Renaissance. But before we get to why this was such a decisive break from the past and propelled society into modernity, let's see how it functioned.
Lean hierarchy, mean harmony.
Let's start with the organizational structure, specifically the hierarchy. There were essentially 3 stages in the lineup of a bottega. You started off life as a garçone, an apprentice. This was when you had to be willing to do any and all types of chores of relevance to workshop, right from, say, sweeping the floor. You lodged in the same building as the bottega, and that was largely your life. In a few years' time, you graduated to a compagno, an assistant or a journeyman. This was, of course, even more serious stuff. By this time, you'd acquired enough skill to take on major portions of the project by yourself, though still largely in an atmosphere of teamwork. With this promotion, you got a proper salary and possibly other perks. And finally, at the top was the maestro. Now, this Italian word doesn't need translating. As the master of the bottega, of course, he had control, visibility, and ultimate responsibility over all the functions of the workshop, where the buck stopped. The cursus honorum of attaining maestrohood was for a journeyman to create his own masterpiece. Yes, literally, a piece of work that signaled you were ready to take the top spot, perhaps by setting up a bottega of your own. But hierarchy is only part of the story here, and the stages of progression did each add value to the overall output. The apprentice did do important work, despite some of it being menial. Picture this scene in our own times, the final interview question. AI can do all this. What can you do that AI can't? Why should we hire you? At least the apprentice of yore could calmly reply, I can sweep the floor.
Not just a pretty face.
Before discussing anything else, let's look at what people did in these bottegas. Our image of the Italian Renaissance is one of pretty pictures and perhaps some finely sculpted statues at most. Yes, all such work took place in these bottegas, but it was much more than that. The disciplines and projects covered here spanned hydraulics, fortifications, and other constructions, clocks, canal systems, metallurgy, chemistry, and included other devices and instruments. Even the activities of churning out those exquisite paintings and sculptures were in fact works of science and engineering, as much as pure art. They were in fact art in the much broader definition of the term I've discussed in my foundational episode TecC de Vida, art, and artifice, meaning skill, and thus analogous to the Greek techne, which gives us the word technology. But here's the crux of the matter. Each team member had a wide range of responsibilities, and it was interdisciplinary. You were, say, learning to sketch and paint, but you'd also learn the science of mixing pigments in the finest and precise compositions to get the perfect colors. You dig deep into anatomy. Well, not literally, although you could argue there was an element of that. More on this another time, I promise. You would work on the science of optics, etc. To enable all these, there were standard processes and procedures that emerged, such as drawing collections and recipe books. Connected to this was the emergence of extensive documentation of processes and procedures, perhaps a first to such degree of meticulous recording. There still are extraordinarily copious amounts of such ricordanze left behind by some practitioners still available to us today.
Founders and funders.
Of course, the question arises, who funded this all? So alongside the artifactual and procedural elements, there arose a sophisticated economic network of participation of various stakeholders in the ecosystem. The main patrons were the large and powerful families such as the Medici in Florence, who sought to works such as the paintings. This was in good part a way of such dynasties signaling their status and power, but also ensuring a smooth pathway to heaven, many of their commissions being religious of nature. Dear Lord our Savior, I've commissioned 23 absolutely comely Madonna paintings in your name. Now about that secure passage to heaven for me. I trust you've put a word to St. Peter at the gates. And there was also the church and the state, where that was different from such grand families. Not always the case. Again, more of this in another episode. That commissioned works. It's not hard to imagine the types of projects the Catholic Church would be interested in, while the political institutions would have among their priorities stuff such as fortifications, canals, and other potentially large-scale projects. Lastly, and I'll get into more detail of this in the aforehinted episode on the Italian city-states and dynastic families, Italy was a patchwork of such city-states, each with similar but different approaches and legal systems. This was, as we saw in the previous episode, also the case more widely in Europe, especially in the German lands where Gutenberg operated, and the factors we've discussed in episode 39 and episode 41 played out.
The first sights of silicon.
Of course, in the modern day, we are quite familiar with a great many of the aspects I've outlined above. We have organizational hierarchies in almost all professional settings, floor sweeping included or not. Actually, that's been replaced by today's interns having to do team-wide coffee-serving runs instead. We have job contracts and salaries. We have procedures and manuals and training programs at every stage of career progression, and as some of us may dread to think, those performance reviews. The funding mechanisms mentioned resemble investment instruments of our own day, including venture capital, angel investor funding, despite some differences in the motivations. Again, the approach is essentially profit-seeking entrepreneurialism operating in a competitive market, driving innovation. Some of the extensive documentation practices even resemble our modern-day open-source mechanisms, not to mention some of them signal the emergence, consciousness, and application of intellectual property to their work and dealings. And many of these bottegas were the startups of their day, Wasn't this the Silicon Valley of its times? Although the Silicon Valley comparison has its limits, I don't think there was a San Francisco in Tuscany. But to appreciate what a remarkable breakthrough this was back in the 1400s, we have to first look at what came before, apart from what all this led to.
Guiding guardians or gilded gatekeepers.
A typical setup in the Middle Ages was the guilds, a concept I've briefly touched upon in episode 36. In the current context, these were associations incorporated to represent specific professions, such as the Guild of Cobblers, to give an example, who took upon themselves the responsibilities of providing that particular good or service. These guilds were primarily concerned with the protection of their members and in the uniform quality of the output by the professionals involved, such that they could decide and enforce a uniform price across the board to the detriment of no individual member of the guild. But this, what they called quality control measure, also meant that there was no room for innovation, for if one of them came up with a better, cheaper way of producing the same thing, that would endanger the incomes of the others. This was further buttressed by a strict segregation of the different professions into their respective guilds, prohibiting, yes, even using the arm of the law, a member of one guild trespassing the activities of another, leaving no opportunity for the cross-pollination of ideas. I hear you say, the cobbler should stick to his last. N. Ultracrepidarian. In correlation to this, the guilds were largely hereditary. If your father was in, you could get in. And even beyond that, they had very high fees for membership, thus imposing massive barriers to entry. In essence, you could say the medieval guilds were monopolist cartels, nepotistic, and exclusionary special interest groups. I mean, in our enlightened times, we don't have professional associations creating an artificial scarcity of supply leading to high prices because, well, they really care for your safety and security, right?
The genie's out of the bottega.
In contrast to much of this, the bottega system was hierarchical yet collaborative. Even the bottega system of hierarchy was in itself different from the guild one. You needed enough expertise to go up the next rung of the ladder. That much we may accept as common sense. But importantly, that career growth was based on a standard and upwardly mobile merit-based procedure. Unlike with guilds, almost anyone could seek to join a bottega, and if you did well, you'd go up the ranks. There were formal contracts and legally binding stipulations laid out to ensure this, even for the lowest rung, who, despite having to start low, knew of the path ahead. The approach to work in the bodegas was both theory and practice, in contrast to a more siloed approach previously. Similarly, they managed to strike a balance between developing in-house proprietary knowledge, uttered by IP protection instruments, and having a pool of, as I said, open-source knowledge that was widely shared in the wider community. The corresponding propensity for documentation this demonstrated meant there was replication instead of duplication. The overall bottega system offered entrepreneurial autonomy, but within broad regulatory frameworks and functioning economic and legal systems of a free market capitalist system. Not perfect, these things are probably never are, but at the very least compared to what came before. And this functioned across the myriad polities of the Italian city-states in the first instance, and to a fair extent further afield in Western Europe, offering a fertile soil for competition and collaboration. And, in line with what we saw with our fictional friends, there was division of labor. There was a certain amount of specialization and responsibility. But here's the kicker. At the same time, there was also interdisciplinary cross-pollination and a significant overlap of remits, as I hinted above. This was indeed the fertile ground that enabled the emergence of the Renaissance man, a multifaceted, cross-disciplinary, skilled polymath, cognizant of and conversant in a wide variety of domains, in the sciences as much as the arts. And yes, rest assured, I'll get to that most representative and quintessential of such a Renaissance man with a deep dive or three. You have the logo of my Substack to vouch for it. In our journey here of studying innovation and progress and seeking to learn lessons from it, we have to pause here to ask the question, just as I did in episode 23, discussing the genius of the ancient Greeks. What explains these extraordinary developments? Compared to developments in my Iron Age phases on the Classical era, 20 to 30, and the Middle Ages, 30 to 40, and much more so to the Bronze Age, 12 to 21, things start to heat up now. The events that come of relevance at this stage on our journey start to move more rapidly and a lot more in parallel to others, and are of even greater relevance to us, as I trust I've demonstrated in the parallels drawn to our own day in the previous section. What essentially is the Renaissance? What rebirth took place? Why are we calling this the early modern? There will be a lot of exploring to do, as I intend to within this phase over at least 2 decades of articles. We're shifting gears, going up a notch, pressing the pedal harder. Stock up on your tea or coffee.